Just like to say hello and welcome to today's talk, which is the second of our LGBT History Month events organised by the staff group. I'm David Mayer. I'm one of the conveners of the staff group, and Sue, who is operating the video recorder, is the other convener. So if you've not been to any of these events before, we do have a mailing list that you can sign up for, and if you pick up a copy of the new Buzz magazine on your way out, if you haven't got one of those, on page 8 there are details of how to contact us and get your name on the mailing list. Sean is very helpfully holding it. Try not to look at it. Try not to.
David's very happy to sign.
Sue and I will sign on the way. Anyway, I'm really delighted to welcome Meg Barker from the Open University here today to give us this lecture entitled Who Are You Calling Queer? And just to give you a little bit of background to why I thought it would be great to get Meg here today. When the staff group started in 2010, there was quite a lot of discussion about what we were going to call ourselves, and various names were put forward. One of the things that I felt quite strongly about was that we tried to have some kind of connection with the student group, who call themselves the LGBTQ student group. But what was really interesting from that was that a lot of people had quite strong feelings about the Q, and some people felt very strongly actually that they didn't want that in the name of the group. We did have a vote on it. We were trying to be democratic, and people were generally actually more supportive of having the Q in the title than not. But nevertheless, that kind of feeling of controversy has continued to rumble a bit really in the background. So what I thought would be really helpful would be to get somebody who knows what they're talking about to come and tell us about the Q word. And so Meg has very kindly agreed to come along today. Meg is a senior lecturer in psychology at the Open University, but that's only kind of one of many activities that Meg's involved with. She's a psychotherapist, an author, she edits the Psychology and Sexuality journal. She's just produced an amazing new publication which Meg will tell us about, the Bisexuality report. There is, I don't know if there's any copies left, but Meg will tell us how to get copies of that later. So anyway, really looking forward to Meg's talk, and there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions, discussions, disagreements, whatever. So do feel free to keep notes as Meg's talking, because I know that she'll be very pleased to answer questions at the end. So I'll hand over to Meg. Thank you very much, Meg.
A really kind introduction, and I don't need to say too much because that's most of the things covered I was going to say.
I'm sorry.
Which you know about me, so that's great. So the presentation is going to be on what queer means and why it might be a useful concept, and particularly I'm focusing really on why we might add a Q to the end of LGBT. So to tie in with what David was saying about possible names for organisations and groups. And also I'm trying to bring in a bit of the history of the term, given it's LGBT History Month as well. So I've aimed the talk really at people without any prior knowledge. So apologies for a start to anyone who has got loads of knowledge about queer politics or queer theory, because I'm going to be touching on those things rather briefly, but hopefully because we will have a long time for discussion, those who know more about those things might be able to add to anything that I've missed out really. I'm also trying out a new style of presentation, this thing called Prezi that I discovered online that people have started using instead of PowerPoint. I think it's awesome, and it's also quite fluid as a style rather than PowerPoint, which is very linear, so I thought it was ideal for queer, because that's really something that queer is all about, is being a bit boring to do it differently. But obviously be patient if I sort of am confused with the technology. I think I've got the handle on it. And yeah, if anyone has a clarifying question, if I say anything while I'm going on that is unclear, or if you can't hear what I'm saying or something, just say, but we'll have this more broad discussion, so if it's more of a discussion point, maybe leave it to the end. So the journey we're going to take is, first of all, a journey around the different meanings of the word queer. then two different reasons why we might employ the term, why it might be a useful concept. Then I also want to raise some notes of caution, not necessarily the same notes of caution that people had, that David was referring to, but there are some reasons to be cautious in our over-embracing of the term queer, and then reach some conclusions at the end. So we zoom in. So, LGBTQ, presuming everyone knows that it's lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans, are the LGB and T. But why might we add a Q at the end? And if we did add a Q, what might it stand for? Well, it can stand for queer, which is what this talk is all about. And when it stands for queer, it opens up the LGBT to identities and practices beyond lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans. So often it gets used there as a kind of catch-all term for any other sexual minorities and gender minorities who might not be included under LGB and T. And part of the reason is to stop the proliferation of a kind of alphabet soup, because LGBT organisations want to be taken quite seriously, and if they become a longer term and have to keep revisiting the term year after year. But when I was part of it was called the Lesbian and Gay Psychology section of the British Psychological Society, for example, and we had a big debate over whether that was going to become the LGBT or the LGBTQ section. Eventually it became the Psychology of Sexuality section and moved away from that alphabet soup entirely. Of course, there's all kinds of trickiness around that, because then you lose those particular words which were there for an important political reason. That still exists. We haven't got the same rights for LGBT people as heterosexual people. So the longest alphabet soup I've seen was LGBTTIQQASMNO. But of course, if we put Q instead of all those others, then we're doing something around maybe erasing those as specific labels and just sort of saying that they can be encompassed under Q. So there's all kind of trickiness we can get into discussing later. The other thing Q might stand for is questioning, which opens it up to people who haven't fixed their identity yet, or maybe they never want to fix their identity. Why you might have a double Q would be for queer and questioning, because it is rather important that those things aren't the same thing. Queer is not the same thing as questioning. And often queer gets used for specific political and theoretical reasons, as we'll see. So it's not just about being unsure about your sexuality, actually it might be being rather sure for political or theoretical reasons why you want to define as Q. So the journey around, these are the four main uses that I could kind of think of or find around the word Q. So we're going to go from the historical term of abuse through to the reclaiming of the word Q, which relates to queer activism and queer politics, because it was queer activists who first reclaimed the term, and then to queer studies and queer theory and what that's all about. So here we go with the term for abuse, and I've included a couple of images at the bottom that suggest that it is still being used in an abusive way today. So obviously before queer had that LGBT meaning, it was just meant to mean strange or odd. So we've got those phrases like now is queer as folk, or all the world is queer except me and thee, and even thou art a little queer, was another sort of usage in that strange or odd way. And I think still I think somebody was saying that Ireland, but also in the north of England, you might get it used without any kind of sexual gender connotation, just as meaning strange or odd still. Apparently Arthur Conan Doyle used Queer Street as a term, and so did quite a few other people. So to be on Queer Street in the 18th century meant to be in either financial trouble or you were going to get punished. And queer started as having that meaning back in the 16th century, and it was only sort of in the 18th, 19th century it began to switch to having a more sexual related meaning, and became a form of hate speech. And when I was doing some research on this, it seemed that one of the first instances was, in the sort of Oscar Wilde case, the Marquess of Queensberry wrote to his son Alfred Douglas, who was all part of that whole the whole case, and queer was used as a form of abuse in that letter. So that was one of those, the first kind of pinpointing it to be used in that way. It was especially used towards effeminate gay men, but also used to just generally refer to things as queer, and kind of by association that meant they were problematic. So it's very similar to the way people might say that's so gay today. They're not really talking about gay, they're talking about something being rubbish, but by association with gay, and that has a homophobic context, and queer is the same way. And that in the America phrase, queer as a $3 bill, is one that's been taken up by activists again, and sort of reclaimed and used in activist scenes and things. So we move from the term of abuse to the, about 2 decades ago, really, in the 1990s, it beginning to be reclaimed as a term. And we can think of it as a similar word, perhaps, to the word nigger, that was reclaimed around the same time by bands like Niggers with Attitude, and generally people using that as a friendly word within black communities to refer to each other. The word slut, again, slightly later on, being reclaimed as a positive term for somebody being, sexually open, as in the book The Ethical Slut. And the word dyke being reclaimed, again, it's not a negative term, but like things like the comic verb dykes to watch out for, an identity term. And that's obviously, that sort of politically reclaiming has then found its way into popular culture. So queer as folk, comes from that. It has got an awareness of that political and historical context. Queer life for the straight guy in America, even less, even more removed from the political context, just using it as a general word that we can use. So that's got in mainstream culture, and also in LGBT culture. It's queer up north. We've got this. I think David was saying a Birmingham event recently had queer culture as one of the so it's being used quite a lot. One thing we might want to take a moment over when we get to the discussion at the end is about the power of reclaiming words. Is it a powerful thing to do? In what context is it powerful? Who gets to reclaim a word? And who gets to use such terms? Is it all right for then everybody to use queer now, or is it only certain groups really who should be allowed to use it? And that all links in to queer activism and queer politics, because it was queer activists who first reclaimed the word. As far as I'm aware, the first sort of reclaimed use was in 1990 and it was part of the Queer Nation group. You can see a picture on that slide. And it was New York Gay Pride in 1990. A flyer was circulated which said "Queers read this." So that was one of the first, reclaimed uses of it. So Queer Nation was founded in the 1990s by ACT UP gay activists. So it came out of kind of AIDS and HIV kind of politics. And it was about an outrage of homophobic violence, the amount of homophobic violence that was still happening. And the thing about queer activism and queer politics was it had a very different agenda to some of the gay politics, for example, of Stonewall and more mainstream organisations like that. It was much more confrontational. So this is where we had things like outing, the outing of people who were, secretly LGBT by groups like Queer Nation. And also confrontational tactics. So Queer Nation was saying that public space is not public space, it's heterosexual space. And we can make that visible, we can show people that actually public space is a heterosexual space by, for example, going there and doing public displays of affection, having a kiss in, or playing spin the bottle in a queer way. And that would demonstrate how public space is only heterosexual space. So it's quite a militant group. Kind of slogans they used were things like "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," or 2468, how do you know your kids are straight? Out of the closets and into the streets. And it was all about, there's a lot of visibility in there. And a similar movement, Peter Tatchell's outrage movement, was a similar movement in the UK to Queer Nation in the US, again as in juxtaposition to something like Stonewall that was more about getting rights on the basis of identity. This was more about making visible how heterosexuality had all the power and trying to maybe undermine that in some way. Another one worth mentioning is the queer eruption, that it's mostly around Europe, I think, but maybe has extended beyond Europe. It's part of something called queercore, which was an offshoot of punk, so I guess sort of 1980s and then 1990s. And it was more about a wider discontent with society. So it was kind of do-it-yourself, grassroots activism that was put about through zines and through music and through art, and about questioning both the orthodoxy of the sort of mainstream politics, but also lesbian and gay orthodoxy. So a lot of the queer eruption people would see like the general mainstream lesbian and gay communities as actually putting themselves in a self-imposed ghetto, that would be anti are maybe something like a gay village, and saying, no, why should people have to be there? And also questioning the way that gay communities maybe embrace consumer culture, or the way that they sometimes are quite anti any form of gender diversity, so that, you know, they were saying that this hasn't gone far enough really. And Queeruption has had annual gatherings since about 1998 at different sites, often squats, and really about challenging mainstream society in quite an anarchistic way, drawing on anarchist politics. There's also now one called Queer Mutiny, which is related to the anarchist movement called Mutiny, which again is sort of anti-hierarchies and anti-capitalist. And finally, the ducky that's on that slide, they run things like called Gay Shame. So Gay Shame has been another movement which runs alongside Gay Pride and is about saying, actually maybe we should be ashamed of the commercialisation and the assimilation kind of politics going on here, questioning whether people should be fighting for things like gay marriage, or whether they should be actually questioning marriage as a kind of institution that everyone should buy into. I think it ties in with many who felt kind of excluded from the commercial gay scene. So when I work in therapy with LGBT people, often finding that bisexual people feel quite excluded from the gay scene, older people feel quite excluded often. There's often an idea that you need a certain kind of appearance to fit into the commercial gay scene. So it's that kind of criticism that queer activism and queer politics is all about. And it's linked to, but not identical to, queer studies and queer theory. So queer studies was the first thing that emerged, and it was about a focus on LGBT. So first of all, queer study was all about looking at the history of LGBT and also LGBT literature, and where those identities were in literature. But it's expanded since, and now you get queer studies really drawing upon all of the disciplines, very interdisciplinary. But it's all about examining the lives, the histories, the perceptions of queer people. And it's about being wider than lesbian and gay studies, which kind of preceded it. So recognising lesbian and gay studies doesn't capture it all. Queer theory, which emerged in the 1990s, is beyond just queer studies. It's not just about examining queer people, but it's about a particular theoretical perspective, which views sexuality and gender as socially constructed categories. So that means that the way that we divide people into male and female and into gay and straight are seen as historical artefacts, that we don't need to divide people up in those ways. The fact that we do, and the fact that those are considered to be the important ways to define people, that's an artefact of a certain time and a certain place, a Western kind of contemporary time. And so people like Michel Foucault, who's up there, in his book History of Sexuality, it looked at the way sexuality had been understood across time and pointed out that heterosexuality and homosexuality were only invented in the 19th century. Those terms didn't apply before that. You weren't really identified as a heterosexual person or a homosexual person until sort of late 19th century. And it was really only with Freud that became seen as a vital part of who somebody was. So before that, obviously, people were doing all the same things, but it was more about activities that somebody did. Activities were seen as maybe sinful or criminal or okay, but not really about identity. And we, I think we think of that, a lot of people think of this whole sexual identity as being this very sort of natural thing, natural way of understanding how people operate. But when we look at different points in time, and when we look at other cultures that understand sexuality and gender in different ways, we realise that actually is quite specific to now and to a certain cultural context. And that's what queer theory is being about pointing out. So yes, it's about saying that people's identities aren't fixed and they can't be categorised and labelled. And as you might know, homosexuality was actually seen as a disorder for some time. It was in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of the American Psychiatric Association until 1973, and it was in the World Health Organization version of SAME until 1992. So that's the kind of thing, particularly, that queer theory would be about, really questioning that you can have this category, and certainly that you have this category and see it as disordered as opposed to ordered. But it goes beyond that and this is why it can be quite threatening or challenging to some who are quite comfortable with an LGBT identity or heterosexual identity. It's like, well, it's questioning this whole idea of identity at all, whether there are even fixed categories, whether we can even use those terms to describe ourselves. And it's saying that maybe why it feels natural to say I'm gay or I'm bisexual or I'm trans is just because we're kind of repeating that identity all the time in the kind of when we interact with other people and to ourselves and in the stories we tell about ourselves. So that becomes sort of a natural feeling thing. But it is something that isn't fixed. It is something that could be changeable. It's something that we might question why we use an identity as the basis for our claims for rights and responsibilities. So queer theory does things like quite celebratory of those who question those boundaries and those identities, and also maybe doing queer readings of things that we might think of as not queer. So Judith Halberstam has been one figure who's particularly done queer readings of like Disney movies or lads flicks and things like that, and sort of pointed out that we could, because heterosexuality itself can be seen as quite unstable within queer theory, we can actually do these readings that make it even less stable or point out how unstable it is. And Judith Butler is another key figure up there. Her book Gender Trouble is one of the founding sort of textbooks in queer theory. Also, there's been a biological scientific kind of take-up of queer theory. So people like Fausto Sterling and Roughgarden have looked actually at biological understandings of sex and of sexuality and pointed out that actually stable binary identities of male, female, gay and straight don't even sort of hold up on a sort of biological scientific level. And it's been linked again to sort of AIDS and HIV because when sort of in the 1980s there was sort of AIDS activism and AIDS became known about, it shifted a focus from identity to practice. So groups that became kind of together in that fight included LGBT people, but also sex workers, people who are HIV positive, health workers, allies of people who are HIV positive. So did you see how that shifted? It was more about practice then again, rather than identities. So that's also kind of bound up in queer theory. So both queer theory and queer activism are really anti what we might call identity politics. It's not all about saying, well, I'm L, G, B or T and therefore I should have rights on the basis of that. It's rather about undermining the whole idea of identity really. And saying in a way identity itself is quite violent. It fixes people. It says that even if you get rights on the basis of it, you're trying to fix yourself in a certain way when actually it's not something fixable, and maybe that's quite a violent thing to do to yourself or somebody else. So here that gives a flavour of what it's all about, all the different ways we might use that term, and also why there might be some real unsettlement and threatening feelings around it, because some of that is quite challenging. So we've seen it could be a term of abuse to a reclaimed term, which links to queer politics and queer activism, and then there's the queer studies and queer theoretical perspectives on it as well. Okay. So, of course, all those different understandings of queer would give us a different answer to the question of should we use the Q. If we understand it as a term of abuse, I'm pretty sure most people would say, yeah, we shouldn't use it. If we understand it as a powerful reclaimed word, yeah, perhaps we should, and maybe it's just a nice umbrella term, but it can include a lot more people under LGBTQ and under LGBT. If we're taking a queer activist stance, then those of us who agree with that politics might be really keen on using it, but those of us who don't might not. And if we take a queer theoretical perspective, then again, some of us are going to say, yeah, we should definitely use queer, maybe we should use it instead of LGBT, and some people are going to be reluctant to use it. So I'm going to give us 4 arguments about why I think we might want to use it, what might be useful about it. As I said, I'll then go on to a few notes of caution. So the 4 things we might consider are using it as an inclusive umbrella term, using it as a way of celebrating difference and diversity, as opposed to arguing for LGBT rights on the basis of sameness. So a lot of LGBT politics is about saying that we're really similar to heterosexual people, really, we have the same kind of relationships, really, we bring our kids up just the same, really. We could use queer as a way of celebrating difference and saying, no, we're not necessarily all the same, and that's okay. Diversity is a good thing rather than a bad thing. we could use queer to open up people's understandings of sexuality and gender. That's something I've used it a lot for, maybe not always using the term, but I think it's important to open up people's understanding of how sexuality and gender work, because those boxes are not very useful either for the people who fit in them or for the people who don't fit in them. So that's another reason you might do it. And linked to that is that because it moves beyond binary understandings, you know, that you're either one thing or you're another, either gay or straight, either male or female. So there's our nice rainbow umbrella. We might use it as an umbrella term. So the reason we might do that involves this word heteronormativity, which people might have come across. So heteronormativity is different from heterosexuality. Heteronormativity is the idea that the normal way to be is to be heterosexual. Often that it's the natural way to be or the better way to be is included in that. So that the idea that all people fall into either male or female and that they should be attracted to the opposite gender, in inverted commas, and that if they're not, they might be attracted to the same gender, and that's not quite as good, but maybe sort of okay, and anything else just doesn't fit at all. And also heteronormativity has the idea in it that people should have certain kinds of relationships, monogamous particularly, certain kind of sex, the kind of sex that's, you know, sort of you see on billboards and in movies and so forth. So we might like queer as an umbrella term because it includes anything outside of that. So it includes same-sex attraction, such as, you know, lesbian, gay identities, but also attraction beyond gender, which would include bisexuality, pansexuality, omnisexuality, etc. It also encompasses people who haven't remained the gender that they were assigned at birth, which includes a lot of trans people and some intersex people as well. It includes people who don't have heteronormative sex, and that would include a lot of kinky people and also asexual people. And it includes people who don't have heteronormative relationships. So that would include non-monogamous people, polyamorous people. So you can see it's not just about, you know, sort of encompassing people who are, say, sexual or gender minorities, but it's actually quite a lot broader than that. And your Q could even end up being a majority of people if we kind of took it to mean all of those things. And it could also include heterosexual people, because heterosexual people aren't necessarily heteronormative. A good example of that would be slash fiction authors. If you've come across people who write erotic fiction about fictional characters, so they often use TV series like Star Trek or recently Sherlock, and they'll go and write about sort of erotic fiction about the characters in those, often the same gender characters in those series, even if they're not actually in relationships in the series themselves. And now when slash fiction first emerged, it was mostly kind of middle-aged heterosexual women who were writing it. And that draws attention to the fact that it isn't explicitly LGBT identified people who are challenging our understandings of sexuality and gender, but it might be what we might look at and see a very mainstream heterosexual person, but actually their sexuality is really quite exciting and complex because they're fantasizing about two guys in a relationship together when they're a woman, so it's kind of gender complex. And also, you know, where is the sexual encounter in somebody writing fiction and somebody else reading it and getting off on it? You know, it sort of questions really, even if people have to be in the same time and place in order to enjoy sex with each other. Obviously, lopsided sex does the same thing. So this is why we might like the umbrella term. It begins to get us really thinking about, well, you know, who's included under heterosexuality or heteronormativity, and then who else might there be, and maybe we can expand our understanding. So linked to this, we might use Q in order to be celebrating difference and not sameness. And this relates to this argument that equal rights are not always equally good. So it's a similar argument that was around feminism as well, you know, early sort of second wave feminists arguing for the right to work outside the home, but people saying, oh, maybe the kind of work that men are doing is not that great either. Maybe we should be questioning working practices rather than trying to get the same working practices for everybody. The way this is played out in lesbian and gay politics particularly has been, as I said, you know, a lot of the research on lesbian and gay rights has been about trying to prove that kids who have lesbian or gay parents are just as well off as kids of heterosexual parents, or fighting for the right to marry, which has been, you know, obviously a really important battle, or fighting for the right to be in the military. Now, the queer perspective on that is, should we be fighting for the right to have a nuclear family, or to get married, or to be in the military, or maybe we should be about saying, hang on a minute, why should anyone be having the state involved in their private relationship, or is military action the best way of dealing with these kinds of conflicts? Another word here that's interesting is homonormativity. So we have heteronormativity, which is saying that heterosexuality is the norm. Homonormativity is an idea that a certain kind of homosexuality is the normal way to be an L, G or B person. And that's somehow better than other kinds. So it's often, sort of the idea of maybe a married gay couple being sort of homonormativity, and then more queer and alternative people not fitting into homonormativity. So the danger, what queer may do with this kind of sameness argument is point out the danger that we might just end up drawing a line with lesbian and gay politics particularly in a different place on a sex hierarchy. The sex hierarchy is this idea by the sociologist Gail Rubin that we have a hierarchy of what's acceptable sexual relationships, and at the top of that hierarchy would be our heteronormativity, but then things occupy a different place. So our married gay couple might be just underneath the top, for example. And so here we've got good, natural, normal, healthy, holy kind of sexuality, and at the other end we've got the worst and least acceptable kind of sexuality. And she pointed out this, at the time of writing in the 1980s, this major area of context in the middle would include unmarried heterosexual people, promiscuous heterosexuals, masturbation, long-term stable lesbian and gay couples, maybe promiscuous gay men would be further down that hierarchy. And so do you get the idea that when we make arguments about sameness and actually LGBT people are nearly the same as heterosexual cisgender people, we just draw a line on that hierarchy in a different place, but that means we still exclude a bunch of people. And we might move from a sameness argument to a diversity and difference argument in order to be not about a hierarchy, in order to be celebrating, actually there's a massive diversity here in terms of sexual behaviours, in terms of sexual attraction, in terms of gender. And even if there's only one person doing a thing, that's okay. It's not about how many people do it or how normal it is or anything like that. It's just about accepting diversity. We might draw lines in different places. We might draw lines about consensuality and say things that are non-consensual are not okay, and things that are consensual are. That might be a different line. But we wouldn't draw the line as about social norms. We wouldn't draw the line as to where society accepts something or doesn't accept something, because we might say that line's a bit spurious. And we can see the problem with that line in things like this sign that I saw that has gay, lesbian, bisexual on it, but the size of the lettering sort of shows you which one. And in America they use GLBT, and the order in there, it shows us kind of who is privileged and who is less privileged within that. One paper I wrote, I tried to change the order around every time I used those four letters, just to try and draw attention to the fact that there is a hierarchy in that. It's not great. And some people have said that it should be really GGGG as well, which is one to consider. So yeah, we see here some things that are about celebrating difference, not sameness. So there's the gay shame, anti-war, end marriage, decenter the centre, calling attention to a certain gay lifestyle as being the normative one and who gets left out of that, etc. So we might use queer as an umbrella term. We might use it because it celebrates difference. We might use it because it opens up our understanding of sexuality and gender. And what's on this, I'll just read it out, that's on the diagram. This is Judith Butler's thing called the heterosexual matrix. So she says generally in society, the way we understand sexuality is that you have a fixed sex, which is male or female, biologically, and then the arrow shows that the culture then builds onto that a kind of stable gender, so male people are masculine, female people are feminine, and that determines your attraction, which would either be to the opposite sex, in inverted commas, but the same sex. And she says this needs to be disrupted in the following way. We need to shift this to an understanding that people have a body, and there's a diversity of different bodies that people have. Not remotely linked to that necessarily is that you might perform an identity, and that might be a different identity at different times in your life or in different contexts. And again, not linked to that necessarily is that you might have desires, and they could be about all kinds of things, not necessarily just the gender of a person, the kind of roles you enjoy, the kind of appearance you like in somebody, whether you enjoy visual or written material or physical engagements. So it's much more diverse. And that might be useful for a lot of people to, I work a lot as a sex therapist, and that's the kind of opening up that we might do in sex therapy, to start people thinking, people come in thinking, I must have this kind of sex with this kind of person in order to be normal. It might be useful to start shifting people's understanding and opening up and saying, well, it's okay to have a different kind of body, it's okay to have a different kind of identity, it's okay to have desires that you have, rather than trying to make your desires into this thing that everyone says is how it should be. And linked to that, we might like the Q because it moves us beyond binaries. So it enables a category beyond gay or straight binary. The binary thing is that, in Western culture, we've for a long time tended to have the idea that things are either ors, you're either this or you're that. And that generally one of those things is slightly better than the other, or a lot better than the other. So it moves us beyond the binary of straight and gay, where straight's a bit better than gay, to queer. It moves us beyond the binary of male and female to encompassing different genders, or the idea of genderqueer being beyond that binary. It moves us beyond fixed categories, and this relates to a lot of research that's been happening lately about sexuality. The finding is it's quite fluid. So Lisa Diamond's research has found that women's sexuality, we study straight and lesbian women and bisexual women, all of their sexuality is quite fluid over the lifetime, not just who they're attracted to, but also how much desire they have, whether they're very sexual or not. These things fluctuate. And there's been other research starting to find that for men this is true as well. Think about sort of metrosexuality and these things that are about sort of recognising a masculine sexuality, maybe not this fixed kind of rigid thing either. It opens up to sex beyond love. Under heteronormativity, love and sex are really tied together when you can only really have sex in the context of love. But obviously there's lots of kind of sex that are not just in the context of a love relationship, or not just about procreation. It opens up to other kinds of relationships beyond what they call a sexual imperative. The sexual imperative is the idea that everyone should be sexual, and that's the normal way to be. And the ace or asexual communities recently have really begun to challenge that idea and say, hang on a minute, it shouldn't be a disorder or dysfunctional not to be that sexual a person, either for periods of your life or for your whole life. And queer can also have implications for other identity categories. So obviously queer theory is all focused on sexuality and gender, but there's other related theories that have questioned other identity categories in similar ways. And also drawn our attention to the way categories intersect. So it's not the same to be a young gay person as to be an older gay person. It's not the same to be a black lesbian as to be a white lesbian. And we start to think all these intersections between gender, race, sexuality, culture, age, geographical location. You can go on and think about those intersections, which make our experience of our identity quite different from somebody else with a similar label. So related to queer theory would be things like critical race theory, which looks, rather than at gender and sexuality categories, how categories of race have operated and the power inherent in that. Disability and crip theory, which have looked at the similar things around who's considered to be able or disabled. Fat activism has started to draw attention on the basis of appearance and thinness and fatness. So. And also recently queer theory itself has begun to look more to the family and this idea of the nuclear family, and that people should procreate in order to continue their selves in a way by having children, and whether that's another normative idea we might start to question. So going back to this, so those are the four beginning reasons why we might like to use queer: because it's more inclusive, because it celebrates difference and diversity, because it opens up how we understand sexuality and gender in a way that might be useful to everyone, and because it moves us beyond binaries. But before we can just say, right, okay, let's get rid of all the other words and just put Q in their place, why might we be cautious? We might be cautious because people understand the term in different ways, as we've seen. We might be cautious because leaping to Q might leave some people out. That Q itself might exclude certain groups, and also that some people do very much experience their sexuality and gender in a binary, fixed kind of way, and is it okay to sort of tell them that they shouldn't experience it in that way? So just put up these images to think, how might these particular people who were sort of classed under LGBT broadly understand the word Q, probably in 4 different ways. When I did a discussion around queer at a sexology event that I ran, one older guy said that he just simply couldn't embrace it because the way he'd been attacked with it for years and years, it just didn't feel like something that was possible for him. Similar issues around the pink triangle, which was a kind of reclaimed thing, but was obviously had implications around the way the Nazis used it. Not everyone is going to be comfortable with that symbol given the historical baggage. And we need cultural sensitivity because all of these words LGBT and Q have developed in a white Western context. They may not be the right words for every cultural context, and other cultural understandings outside of that context of how sexuality and gender operate may be very different. They may not need a word that disrupts identity because they may not see identity, sexuality and gender as identities in the first place, or they may already have a concept of sexual fluidity or gender fluidity in the diversity of cultures that exist. This is important and partly why we put together this report that David is mentioning. We don't want to leap to Q before bisexual and transgender rights have been established. The LGBT, very much the B and T, are still, at places where they're not very visible necessarily, and the rights for that have not been established. You've just got to look at the way the media depicts bisexual and trans people to see that we're a long way away. We're a long way away with LNG, but we're a really long way away with B and T, right? And the thing about bisexuality is that, as this report from San Francisco displays, that it's still very invisible. Now, if we leap to Q, we may leave bisexuality just as invisible as it was. So it's invisible when we understand human beings as either being gay or straight. There's no place for bisexuality. But if we move straight to a kind of Q, and an idea that everyone is Q, then again, there's not much space there for bisexual people who feel that their attraction is to both genders and that there are 2 genders. So we don't want to leave them out by just leaping forward. Similarly, with trans, there's a risk in Q of a kind of hierarchy of trans, whereby those who are embracing of the idea of being genderqueer and operating outside the binary of male and female are seen as somehow better than those who transition maybe from one gender to another and do see it as a 2-gender system. And probably the majority of trans people would see it as kind of transitioning from one thing to another. So we don't want to sort of privilege one kind of transness or one kind of bisexuality over others. And also there's a burden placed by queer theory particularly upon bisexual and trans people, as if they are the people who should be at the forefront of kind of this queer movement and of making everything different and challenging the binaries. But to be visibly attracted to more than one gender and kind of make that clear in public space, or to be visibly outside of male or female, and again, in public space, demonstrate that with your body or with your identity, those are quite dangerous things to do, especially given the rate of transphobic violence that exists. So should we really be placing that, the onus on people who are already in kind of a vulnerable and marginalised group, or should queer be more about questioning the spaces and the discourses that make people feel that they have to fit this binary, rather than putting all the pressure on people themselves to be doing this. Maybe it's different in academic spaces or in specifically queer spaces, but in the world in general, it's very difficult at the moment to operate outside those binaries. So we should be a bit careful of trying to, assume that people should be doing that. And there's a whole, again, we could get into discussion, there's a whole thing about how we fight for rights. Do we strategically use LGBT, even if we think actually it's more complicated than that because people understand those terms? Or do we strategically use ideas like biological essentialism, the idea that people are biologically LGBT, even though, again, we know it's more complicated than that, biology's in there, but it's much more complicated within a wider psychological and social framework, as well as the biological being in there. we can come back to that debate. Who might remain excluded if we jump to the queue? Non-academics would be a big one. I just want to read you a little confused butler here. So she's well known for being rather hard and impenetrable. So this is a quote from her. Gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. In fact, it's a kind of imitation that produces the very notion of the original as an effect and consequence of the imitation itself. What they imitate is a phantasmic idea of heterosexual identity. Gay identities work neither to copy nor emulate heterosexuality, but rather to expose heterosexuality as an incessant and panicked imitation of its own naturalised idealisation. That heterosexuality is always in the act of elaborating itself is evidence that it is perpetually at risk, that it knows its own possibility of becoming undone. It's brilliant. When you sit with it for a while, and you kind of, it's saying something brilliant, but it's very inaccessible. Yeah? It's very inaccessible to an audience that don't necessarily have an academic education, and that in itself is linked to race, class, wealth, etc. So we might see queer as excluding. The other people that maybe queer politics is more excluding of would be less sexual or asexual people, because queer politics, as I mentioned before, has been quite often about showing that public spaces are heterosexual by going in there and being explicitly sexual in queer ways within those spaces. But recently there's been quite a lot of writing by ace people saying, hang on a minute, I can't go to queer positive spaces or to queer events because they're so hypersexual. The assumption is that people be sexual. And that in itself is kind of heteronormative, because it reinforces the idea that everyone should be sexual, which is one of the things we might question. And it's also excluding of those who experience gender as binary, as many LGBT people do experience it. Sexuality is fixed, as many LGBT people do experience it. And yourself as being born this way, because there is an emphasis more on choice and fluidity. And that's not to say we don't need queer, but it's just to say if we do use it, there are going to be people who feel excluded from it for various reasons. Depending on the way we use it, of course. So again, it's about having to clarify the meaning too. So 4 reasons to be a bit cautious, which we can discuss. And queer theory also has been criticised for neglecting the experience of real queer people. It's often focused on things like literature and film rather than actually interviewing, say, or finding out about the experience of queer people themselves. And that's a shift that's occurring as well. And maybe bringing in queer theoretical perspectives with a much more grounded rooted in what do LGBTQ people experience themselves might be a kind of good way forward here. So just to conclude, what I'm saying, I think in a nutshell, is it's important to understand the word, and it is very important to affirm queer experience. And if we do leave Q off the LGBT, then we are going to be excluding people in a damaging way. However, we do need to leave open also the possibility that not everybody experiences themselves and their world in a queer way. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Meg. Yeah, have a seat. I'm sandwiched. It was a really fascinating lecture. I think one of the things for me, whenever I kind of think I've pinned myself down, I hear something like this and it just kind of throws it all back open again. And I think to begin with, that always felt quite threatening in a way, but as I've got used to the idea and thought about it much more, it actually seems potentially quite liberating. But thank you very much, Megan. It's been really interesting talk. Lots of stuff that I know you've kind of touched on, and there's lots behind it, but thank you very much for that. So I think we just kind of open it to discussion now, questions, thoughts, comments. I think it would be very easy to answer.
Yes.
Do you have any sort of thoughts on why people would want to rehabilitate a term like queer in the first place, or dyke, or any of those terms you were mentioning earlier? Seems to be a tendency. Is it to galvanise people, or?
No, it's a really good. I mean, I think it takes some of the power away from the thinking of it as an insult, doesn't it? Or what do other people think? Is that a useful project to reclaim terms of abuse?
I think it can be quite risky. I think like you said, I think some of it is about taking power away, potentially, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think one of the questions you asked earlier was, but then who can then use it? Because while someone may choose to reclaim the word queer or dyke or whatever, if somebody who's not visibly from within that community uses it, I would probably still judge them for using that word in an abusive way.
Yes.
And so is that fair?
That's right.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't reclaim the words, but I just think it's quite a tricky process to go through.
Yeah. Well, there's been a really interesting debate around the word tranny recently in trans communities, because quite a lot of trans men were using the term, and then some trans women were saying that mostly that has been a term of abuse applied to trans women and transvestite women and transsexual women. And so is that okay then for trans men to reclaim that term, or should that be trans women's job if they want to do it or don't want to do it? And I think all of these terms you could similarly unpack in that same way. So yeah, it's different probably for maybe a white gay middle class man to start using the word queer than it might be for a black lesbian sex worker to start using the word queer, and who is allowed to and who isn't. I think it's important to think about it. Yeah.
I think it very much depends on context. I mean, you take the disability movement, it's all very well to reclaim the word crip or even the word spaz, which is controversial.
Yeah.
But, I work in disability as a professional, and it's not appropriate for me to use those words in a professional context unless that person chooses to use that word.
Yes.
I don't like the word hearing impaired used against myself. I really hate it. But as a generic term, it's neutral.
Yeah.
And therefore it's more appropriate to use a neutral term that's liable to be, making the point without upsetting people than putting people into identity boxes and getting into identity politics, because otherwise you get nothing done. So some of it is about, having some neutral terms and then thinking about how you reflect and mirror language. And that very much depends on your context. Are you in a one-to-one contact? Are you in a room like this?
Yeah.
And again, your privilege and the other person's privileges come into that. But you can't necessarily assume that is the other question,
Yeah, so do you think that leaves us with maybe sexual and gender minorities? Is that the kind of the version of, say, hearing impaired in terms of this space? Would we want to use, would it be okay to use Q or even LGBT? Should we go to a very neutral?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I don't know. I think, having it, if it's a group for ourselves and about us, by us, then I quite like the Q, personally. But then, I'm only 30, I don't have the age wince behind it. I've not really had it used against me in anger. And I think that's why I think, you perhaps need to embrace the power of and you need to kind of take a sort of executive decision, at some point make a decision and accept that it's one of 5 letters and it's excluding and including at the same time. You can't please everybody all of the time. Just like the word disabled has problems, and then you end up with abled or enabled or and then you get to the point where you don't mean anything anymore.
Yes.
Because as a disabled person, if I want practical information, I'm not looking for accessibility or enabled or something really politically correct. I'm looking for the word disabled because I'll now find something.
Exactly.
So, you've got to be findable, and then you turn into academics where you can't say anything without a 50-paragraph sentence.
Yes, and lots of brackets, making a clever point. Totally, thank you,
I think it's sending out dodgy signals when perhaps 2 gay men in the street are calling each other queer. And Mr. Homophobe walks past and hears, they're calling each other queer, I'll call them queer, and then you want this person prosecuted, under homophobic laws, when you've just called each other queer, and, how do you differentiate between it to somebody who might think it's the norm to call somebody queer? And in Manchester we've got, or did have, a nightclub called Queer across the door. Now somebody shouting at these gay people walking into the club, oi, queer's like, you're going into a club that's called queer, it's like we're sending out very mixed signals,
So that's a tricky one with that. But then, that it's interesting though with gay, isn't it? Because that's been, certainly in the last decade, more of an insult term. And I don't expect we take the gay out of LGBT or out of nightclubs because somebody might say, oh, they're so gay, and then you can't say, I think that's a really tricky, because it's a powerful thing, but as you say, it could really be used against people in much more mainstream culture, whereby there wouldn't be an understanding of the nuance. Yeah.
So, if radicalism is an inherent part of queerness as a label, will it stop working if everyone accepts it?
Yeah.
Because if it becomes the normal term.
I think all the politics I want to be involved with is the kind of politics that will make it totally, not necessary anymore if it ever achieves the same. Because you could say the same about feminism. You could say, what feminism wants is to not need feminism anymore, and what queer wants is maybe to not need queer anymore. But it is a funny one, because then you think, well, when does that point arrive? Luckily, it hasn't. It's probably a long, long way in the future, so we can keep at it for a while. But yeah, that's a good point. And also, I suppose as well, just that not everyone is using it in that radical way. Some people are using it simply as an umbrella catch-all or something, and that's tricky. Yeah.
I really enjoyed that, because it's something that I struggle with, and I guess I flip back and forth in terms of what I think about it. But you sort of early on were saying that one of the notions of queer was that it, stepped away from identity politics or tried to undermine some of those problems with identity politics, which is partly what I love. But then if we just add the Q on to the LGBT, does it not just become another identity category? If we're saying it's there for people who define in that way, but let's still hold on to the LGBT for the people who want to define in that way, does it not just become another identity category of choice?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure a lot of people who are really sort of involved with queer politics would necessarily want it to be on the end of LGBT. I've not really talked to people about their stance on that, but it would be a fun, but then it becomes a funny thing to even say I'm queer or I'm genderqueer, because it's not an identity and you can use it as a label.
You've got the difficulty of, we've been talking about radical politics. What about people who don't want to be radical?
Yeah.
That idea of, I'm sick of everybody being right on than there or whatever, and it's like saying, that's not where I personally sit, and that can be quite difficult in any identity politics, is not to erase people who don't agree with your, let's say you're an anarchist, then how do you agree with people who aren't anarchist and are perhaps, much more capitalist in their thinking? And
it's a real challenge. I mean, I think one place where that really was brought home to me was running events around open forms of non-monogamy and particularly polyamory. And at one event a few years back, there was a real sense that sort of half the room were from a very queer and quite anarchist perspective, and they were really anti the idea of fighting, say, for marriage between more than two people. The other half of the room really wanted that kind of right, because they weren't coming from that kind of politics, and they were also thinking, well, we're getting attacked when we've got kids, we're getting neighbours sending us social workers around, stuff like that. If we had relationship recognition in the form of marriage or something similar, then that wouldn't happen anymore. And that, the two groups were just so couldn't speak to each other very easily, because they were coming from such different places politically. And I think that's sort of, you get that kind of tension a lot, and I am really interested in how we can speak across those tensions, not in a way to try and make them go away, because they're useful, interesting, tensions to have, but how can we actually have a dialogue there when it's such a difference? Yeah.
I think it's about not making assumptions. Somebody that talks about an American international icon, and how they had a speaker who was an American Democrat, and went on about how all anti-Republican this, anti-Republican that. And then he said, anybody who's not going to vote Republican should just get out of the room now. So my friend stood up and left, because he wasn't an American and he wasn't going to vote Republican or something. And it was all this kind of difficulty of this assumption that if you were in that room, you were a political party of choice, and just the overall assumption that people made, and that, we've had people sort of say, oh, I don't feel I can say that I'm a gay conservative.
There's a lot wrapped up into LGBTQ, I think, that assumptions about a political stance and assumptions about the kind of background people will have, and education. I think that one gets left out so much, that sort of assumption of a certain level of education and a certain familiarity with theory.
But I've always thought that one of the most political things you can do as a member of any minority community is to live that life and it just be there and do it, and so that in the world of work people know that perhaps you're not heterosexual, or you're not in the gender you were born into, and that sense of just being who you are is unfortunately becomes a political act. It shouldn't need to be, but it almost does, and I always feel that the most important thing I can do, I don't do much activism, I don't do marches or anything, the most important thing I can do is just live my life the way I live it, and be reasonably unapologetic about it and just deal with the crap as and when it comes.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because one of the things I feel working, say, in the counselling service, is that, you know, there's a lot of liberal talk around about how, this is a very accepting space, a university, what have you. But I kind of often think, well, you know, I never see two guys walking around campus holding hands, or maybe stood at a bus stop having a kiss. Might occasionally see two women, but not very often. And so I think what you were saying about how, you know, public space is still heteronormative, and I think that is pretty rigid, even on a campus like this. You know, and I just don't know how you kind of begin to break that down.
No, there's a real. I think I do a lot of blogging, and I put out loads of posts on quite a lot of controversial issues last year, and the only post that got a load of negative responses was one about heteronormativity, because, you know, I tried to do like a, you know, why is heteronormativity a problem? And I thought, I just didn't expect it, but people really hated it, really hated the concept, really, you know, and I was trying to say really clearly, it's not saying heterosexuality is wrong, not at all, it's about saying the idea that heterosexuality is the only normal, natural, good sexuality. That's not good for anyone, that's not good for heterosexual people, it's not good for people excluded by, really doesn't, people don't like that, you know. Quite a lot of people who were actually quite okay with quite a lot of other critical stuff, because people who read my blog were not necessarily, you know, that mainstream, but they really didn't like that concept. So, you know, there's another, and that really, I struggle with that. Then I think, well, you know, should I just say, well, sod those people, you know, I'll write for the other people, or you know, should I find a way to communicate with those people, you know, maybe not using that term, or maybe not using the term queer, because I think they actually have something to learn from these ideas. But then, you know, that's quite uncomfortable, saying, well, I'm not going to use that terminology because it upsets people, you know, really quite attention.
I think we're into the difference there between what in legal terms is framed as direct discrimination versus indirect and systemic discrimination.
Yeah.
You know, I work in a really lovely liberal building. I'm